In this video, we're going to talk about the decision of whether to sell or process a joint product further. So let's say that we have a dairy farm and we produce some raw milk at a cost of $300,000, and then there's a separation process which has $200,000 in costs we incur, but it leads to two joint products. We have whole milk and we have cream. Okay, so these are our joint products. And we can look at the sales value of each of these joint products at this point in time. So if we sold the cream now, we'd get $360,000. If we sold the whole milk now, we get $240,000, right? So we could just go and sell these products right now, but let's just say that there was a process that we could do. We could do some additional processing, and that would incur some incremental costs, but that processing would enable us to sell these products for a higher dollar value, right? If we turn the cream into sour cream, we could sell it for $500,000 instead of selling the cream for $360,000, right? And also, we could sell the milk. If we turn it into non-fat milk, we sell it for $300,000. Whereas if we just sell it for the whole milk, let's say we get $240,000. So now here's the question: do we just sell these products at this point in time, right? Or do we do the additional processing and sell them at this point in time? And which costs are relevant in terms of helping us make this decision? So what you ultimately want to do is we want to take the incremental revenue that we get from additional processing, so the incremental revenue, minus the incremental costs. Okay? So, with the cream to sour cream, what we're basically going to say is the incremental revenue is the sales value we get if we process it, $500,000, minus the sales value it had before, which is $360,000. So $500,000 minus $360,000 is $140,000. Okay, that's the incremental revenue from turning the cream into the sour cream. Now the incremental costs, right? We're going to say that, let's say there's incremental cost of $150,000 here. Okay, so it's going to be $150,000. And just bear in mind, here I've just said that I'm just talking about the incremental cost of further processing. There might be other costs of further processing, like you have a specific machine or something that turns the cream into sour cream, and that machine requires some maintenance or something like that. We're not going to get into all that here. We're just going to make it simple and just say there's $150,000 of incremental costs. But if there are costs that are not incremental, then we don't want to worry about those, right? They've already been incurred. So what happens here is we have a loss. We would incur a loss of $10,000 for the sour cream, right? That we haven't got into the whole milk to milk yet. We'll get into that separately. But for turning the cream into sour cream, we're going to get an extra $140,000 revenue, but it's going to cost us an extra $150,000. So this is a bad idea. We should not be doing the cream to the sour cream. But now let's do the milk, right? So with the milk, we'll say the incremental revenue. I'll just abbreviate REV here, and then we've got the incremental cost, right? And we want to do the exact same thing. And so we're going to say, okay, incremental revenue is $300,000 we'd get if it was processed all the way to non-fat milk, minus the $240,000 that we could get right now as whole milk without any other processing. So that's $60,000 we would boost our revenue if we did the further processing. Now the incremental cost associated with further processing is $55,000, right? So $55,000. So what does this mean? Well, if we subtract the cost from the revenue, that means we would get an additional $5,000 if we process the whole milk and turn it into non-fat milk. So what should we do? Well, yes, we would process this further. So the cream, we say no, do not process further. But the whole milk, the non-fat milk, we do process further. Now, here's an important point. Here's a very important point. When we're making this decision, it looks obvious, hey, yes, obviously we're going to do this. But sometimes, because a firm has allocated some joint costs, right? So when you've allocated joint costs, that can actually make it where it looks like it would not be profitable to do the further processing when in fact that is the optimal thing to do. Let me give you an example and make it a little easier to understand. So remember, we had $500,000 here in joint costs, right? So remember, joint costs are just costs that are incurred prior to the split-off point, right? And the split-off point happens right here when the products become uniquely separable, right? So we've got whole milk and we've got cream. At that point, that's the split-off point. And so the joint costs, here the $500,000 in joint costs, let's just say that this firm had allocated 50% of those costs to the whole milk and 50% to cream, right? So 50% of 500,000, and the reason I got 500, just took the 300,000 for the raw milk and 200 for the separation process. If we take 50% of that, we allocate half of those 500,000 to whole milk or to one product line and half to the other. Then what we would have is the following: we would have a situation where we'd be saying, okay, let's look at this whole non-fat milk. We'd say 300,000 we ultimately get as the sales value for the non-fat milk, and then we'd look and say, okay, now the incremental cost of processing is 55,000, right? And then we say half of those joint costs that we were talking about before, so that's 250,000. And then now if we subtract all this here, what do we get? We get negative $5,000. Okay, so this is if we allocate 50-50, 50% of joint costs. 50% of joint costs. So this makes it look like it is not profitable for us to make this non-fat milk, right? Because we just said, hey, look, we just took the revenue we get from the non-fat milk and then we subtracted the costs. And so, but here's the problem. This $250,000, this is just costs that have been allocated, right? All these joint costs are irrelevant when we're deciding what to do with the product after the split-off point, okay? Before the split-off point, when we're just deciding, hey, do we even want to be operating this dairy farm? Is this even profitable? Okay, we can make that decision then, right? We can, before the split-off point, at this point here, that's when we care about those costs. But now that we're actually we've got the products, they're uniquely separable. We got the whole milk sitting there, we got the cream sitting there. We've already incurred the joint costs, right? So this $250,000 isn't relevant after the split off point. When we're deciding whether or not to process the milk or the cream further, what we really want to do is just look at the incremental costs and benefits of doing so. So we just want to say, okay, look, at this point, it would be $55,000 extra to turn that whole milk into non-fat milk, right? And we would get an extra $60,000 in revenue for doing so. So we get $5,000 profit out of doing that. We don't care at this point what the joint costs were or whatever. So those costs have already been incurred, and so they're not relevant to us after the split-off point.